Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, the next election for the European Parliament will be the 9th one, and it's going to be held from this Thursday to Sunday. A total of 751 members of the European Parliament currently will be representing 512 million people from 28 different member states. Now, EU officials are complaining that Russia is using disinformation or fake news to affect the results of the European Parliament. But what is the evidence there against Russia, about Russia's meddling, and what is the state of affairs of the EU Parliament itself with an increasingly lower turnout since the past 14 years? To discuss this and more, we have with us a full panel of guests. Let me introduce who we have with us today. We have Professor Uli Brueckner. He's a professor of EU Studies in Dresden. And also we have with us Dr. Leonid Petrov, an IR expert joining us from Sydney. And we have Professor Christian Kaunert, a professor of policing and security, and also the director of the International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. Welcome to all three of you to Newswire. Let me start with you, Dr. Leonid. EU officials say that Russia is using disinformation to influence this outcome of the European Parliament elections. How seriously should their warnings be taken, in your opinion?
Well, we live in the era of post-truth, as it was informed by the previous U.S. elections, where any news, any information can be discussed and described as a kind of fake news. On the other hand, when we also live in the 21st century of communications and technologies, which makes it's very difficult to trace the culprits of intervention, hacking, any kind of electronic meddling with the electoral or any processes. It's very difficult to prove or disapprove. And I think that Russia is using this ambiguity in potentially trying to sway the election. But on the other hand, nobody knows exactly in what form. And also the wars which have been waged recently, also known as the hybrid wars, they used without cannons and guns, with electronic methods, which is supposed to be the peaceful way of influencing people with media, with information or disinformation. So again, we're facing the great deal of uncertainty and ambiguity in this, and it will be very difficult to find any solid piece of evidence which may lead to Moscow or to Beijing or Pyongyang or Washington, D.C. We don't know.
It is certainly a very grey area whether the information being called disinformation is actually fake or it is an interpretation which should be taken under the freedom of speech idea. So, Professor Uli, what do you think? That it has some kind of weightage, or what EU officials are worried, considering what Russia's history has been and with the US elections?
Well, Russia certainly has an interest in destabilizing the EU. I think this is important to have in mind when we look at the different way things appear. Of course, there's not one giant cyber attack and then everyone can claim it has been Russia that manipulated the elections. I'm pretty sure that Russia became much more sensitive about how public opinion pays attention to the role of Russia in Western elections. But it is clear they have a motivation. They are very well prepared. Russia has enormous potential in using cyber warfare. They have prepared for more than 10 years, since 2008, to create something like a hybrid warfare strategy. And it's much cheaper than attacking with conventional weapons because our lifelines become so much more vulnerable. And Russia is very flexible in using different techniques. But it's not a question about evidence. The evidence is there. We just don't know how intense the manipulation will be.
Right. And Professor Christian, what's your take on the concerns that EU officials have ahead of these EU elections?
Yes, I think the concerns have to be taken very seriously indeed. I think the cyber dimension is in fact one important dimension in terms of manipulating these elections and having a significant influence on the European elections, but it is not the only way in which Russia asserts its influence on the European elections. One of the important things just came out over the weekend Ibiza scandal in Austria, Russia has been financing a lot of the far-right parties right across the European Union for a number of years, whether that is the Freedom Party in Austria, whether that is Front National in France, whether that is, in fact, UK Independence Party, and a significant impact that Russia has had during the Brexit referendum. So it isn't just, when we talk about manipulation of elections, we're not just talking about cyber attacks, we're talking about influence on the entire political spectrum. And there's a lot of evidence, really, that Russia has been significantly involved.
And something of that sort is also it is apparent in the voter turnout aspect of this, Dr. Leonid, when we see that the turnout is continuously lower than it was 14 years ago. This is, as some analysts are saying, as a result of disinformation also, and could be also exploited by not just Russia, but other actors.
Absolutely. It's not only Russia who may be trying to influence it, may be the opposition, some contestants of the election might not be interested in bringing more or otherwise bring more participants into the election. But I think it's up to the European countries what to do about it. For example, in Australia, just last weekend, the national election took place where 99.9% of voters turned up, and we saw it because the national law in Australia demands that all citizens have to participate and vote, otherwise they are going to face a fine or potentially imprisonment or other penalties. So if the European Parliament wants the participation to be decent, I think the legislative assemblies and parliaments, national parliaments, have to do something about it, or otherwise one day won't be any significant turnout, and we will see that democracy will be completely perverted.
Right, and Professor Uli, just on that also, there is this fear, as was just highlighted, that is being stoked by Moscow allegedly. The discontent that the voters have, how can one clarify or sort of understand that this stands separate from any kind of propaganda? It is inherent in the system in itself, as EU has been blamed continuously for having a disconnect with the people, the actual people on the ground, who are not belonging to the rich classes and whose EU's decisions affect the most.
Well, we have to be very careful in not overestimating the importance of such forms of disinformation. Because when we look back to the development of voter turnout from 1979, when the European Parliament was first elected, it is constantly declining. And one can, of course, criticize the voters for not being good Democrats and not actively participating in the vote. But it is also a rational decision when you study how the European Union functions and realize that the European Parliament is not as strong as, for example, the Danish Parliament, which has a very prominent position in the Danish political system. So it's on the one hand, the lack of information, that people don't understand as much as they understand about their own political system. But it's also kind of rational to wait until one day the supranational level of the European Union will have so much importance that the best politicians and the most intense political debates happen on the European level, and not everything is a variation of a national campaign. And by the way, we also elect members of the European Parliament, because currently the focus is much more national, in national publics, and not so much a European-wide demos.
Right. And Professor Christian, when we talk this, we talk about the evidence that is available, say, through companies like Stratcom Task Force, which was created back in 2015 with the very objective of taking action against perceived Russian disinformation. Where does this evidence stand in being corroborated and coming out as something one can rely on?
Yes, in terms of Russian involvement, there is, in fact, plenty of evidence. You can Google a lot of it on the internet. It is quite widely available and it is shared. It is not so much of a question, is the evidence there, but it's kind of, well, what can the European Union really do against some of those things? I mean, because the Russian approach is to look at vulnerabilities of European societies and attack those very vulnerabilities. This means that, of course, these vulnerabilities need to pre-exist, right? Otherwise, they couldn't possibly be exploited. So Russia uses inherent conflicts that already exist in society, and every society in the entire world has inherent conflicts. That isn't something that a society can live without. But of course, it is then the use and abuse of those societal conflicts that Russia is, in a sense, using to influence the political landscape in Europe.
But there's also this concern about whether the EU is in or is willing to take the action needed to counter this kind of disinformation or meddling from other actors, whether it's Russia or someone else. Dr. Leonid, what do you think? EU is taking the right steps to counter it? Excuse me.
Well, of course, there's a certain anxiety about Russia, its role in mysterious events and killings and meddling in not only electoral campaigns and Brexit, but into money laundering and illegal smuggling and weapon sales, which comes from not only from Russia, but from the area known as the former Soviet Union. The Novichok incident, the annexation of other territories, of course, makes the European Union very nervous about what may be next expected from Russia. Well, I think that it depends on how the Europeans consider their own vulnerabilities and their also their own power to defend themselves. As part of NATO, I think European Union can be quite certain that it's not going to be any encroachment in its territories anymore. But in terms of new technologies, in terms of disruptive technologies, nobody can be 100% sure that water or sewage or electricity grid is going to function when something happens with just a switch of a button. And I think Russian hackers, and not only Russian and Chinese and any non-governmental group may cause chaos to any overdeveloped society in Western Europe, in North America, or in Eastern Asia. So we have to be prepared for contingencies. And for that, I think collaboration is important.
Right.
The European Union has some programs which collaborate with, including with Russian government. I think it will be much easier to find the culprits and trace the wrongdoers, even with the help of the Interpol or any international agencies.
Right. So also there has been a protest that's just taken place in Berlin. 20,000 people essentially came out on the streets protesting against the far-right parties in the EU, fearing that they are the ones who will make gains in these elections and they will essentially destroy Europe. Now, that's a pretty big protest. Professor Uli, this question is for you. Do you feel like this would be something that would be created from disinformation, or it could be taken advantage of by meddlers in trying to push a certain agenda?
Well, the protest is not a protest of anger against the establishment or something. It's more the opposite, that people suddenly realize with developments like Brexit that we have something to lose and we have to take action to defend what essentially protects our human rights, our Western lifestyle, our democratic system, and our welfare state. So it's not so much about the European Union to be blamed in what populists portray as it's not the European Union as such that stands for peace, stability, and prosperity, but it's actually the problem that people demonstrate in the streets and put flags on their balconies and take action to show a commitment that they feel European and demonstrate in the streets, which hasn't been the case before. So it's not about change as such, but it is about we have created something. It created the longest period of peace, and we are willing to stand up and defend it because they are enemies of the open society. And we as citizens have to stand up and show that we feel European and we understand what it brought to us. All
right, Professor Christian, about what analysts are also saying that Russia, using RT and Sputnik, their national news broadcasters, are pushing a specific agenda with regards to EU. Again, it comes into a very gray area. How does one determine whether this is something could be taken as a normal news coverage or to be identified as, again, a sort of an agenda-specific broadcast?
Well, it's a good point, really. I mean, those media outlets are being used to pursue a particular agenda. And the way in which you can determine that is, of course, by looking at what evidence do we have and how is that evidence portrayed and what evidence is being reported and what evidence isn't being reported. I mean, I've had personal experience of being interviewed by those news agencies, and I can certainly suggest that the line of questioning that comes is usually guided questions. You know, it's not asking a question where you have an open answer, where you look at the evidence and objectively determine the outcome, but they're really questions that are determining the outcome, what they would like you to say. And I think people are chosen on that particular basis.
So what do you think, Dr. Leonid? Do you feel like that there's a problem here, especially when it comes to news coverage and when we see items on the EU Parliament elections coming up again and again on RT and Sputnik and other Russian-based channels? Do you see that this could be a problem, a very easy way to disinform the public?
Yes, I think that currently the Iron Curtain is being raised between Russia and the West. Not so much from the eastern side, because we see that China is already surrounded by the Great Wall of China, and North Korea has not changed since 1950s and 60s. But with the European Union and the level of freedom and the level of freedom of information, it becomes increasingly difficult for President Putin and his administration to survive the influx of information and alternative channels of information. So, for example, domestically, Russia has national elections, but in fact, elections stopped back in year 2001. After that, there are no alternative candidates. There's no process of free debate and discussion. So it doesn't matter what media covers it. There's simply no way of running independent electoral campaign in Russia. And of course, what happened yesterday in Ukraine, in Kiev, the inauguration of newly elected President Zelensky became a very important and subversive piece of information for Russia. For example, Russian news channels domestically put it as news number 3, deliberately trying to tone down the importance of the free elections and independent courts and free media. So what happens with outlets like RT and Sputnik? They work internationally. It's a kind of export type of information for foreign consumption only. Russians don't really consume what Sputnik or RT do. But when Russians who live overseas, they can't really listen to this kind of propaganda because it's laughable. It's the spectrum of news and the scope of analysis is really truncated. And
it's very obvious.
It cannot compete with the West in terms of the freedom of information. And what Russia is trying to do is to raise the Iron Curtain to separate itself. And even the new laws, which potentially may disconnect Russian internet from the World Wide Web, has been adopted in the Russian Duma parliament recently.
Right. And now we're being joined by guest, Mr. Florian Peschl. He's an independent political researcher and journalist speaking to us from Vienna. We're talking about how can the EU guarantee that its efforts to tackle Russian disinformation doesn't interfere with a democratic debate, a legit debate on what is going on in the ground.
I think that's very difficult to guarantee. Actually, Russian disinformation campaigns are designed, we know that from the KGB already, they are designed to exploit the weaknesses of a society. And in what is one of our strengths, or what people in the West appreciate, most people, is freedom of speech, but it's also a weakness in terms of you cannot really regulate it.
Right, so it's very difficult to regulate. But do you like the EU is making adequate effort to counter this? And is it being effective at all?
I think the EU itself, the European institutions, are putting a lot of effort into this. They take it very seriously. The problem is we have different kinds of publics in Europe, and there are also nation-state governments and nation-state authorities. And in some countries, like in Hungary or in the Czech Republic, it's sometimes not taken that seriously.
Okay, so Professor Christian, just the Russians or who are just spreading this disinformation, or there are other actors involved here?
Look, I mean, when it comes to disinformation, you cannot say there's only one actor involved. But when it comes to the specter of Europe, then it is, of course, the dominant actor, that is Russia. There's a possibility of other actors. And of course, also America has been mentioned, especially under President Trump. Obviously also with links to Moscow. But there can be potentially also other actors, but it depends a little bit on what the strategic objectives are. Russia has clear strategic objectives right now. Other actors at the moment have potentially less strategic objectives in Europe than Russia has. And for that reason, Russia is, of course, the more dominant actor in this particular activity.
Right. And Mr. Florian, though we talked a little earlier before you joined us here, we talked about the East Startcom task force that was created essentially to focus on media outlets, Russian media outlets that had connection to the Kremlin. Now, it doing its work, it's doing its job, also came under a lot of fire back in 2018 when it sort of listed articles that it believed that a Dutch media outlet had spread disinformation. Now, there is a very gray area on where do you draw the line and how do you identify, especially for voters who at this critical time are depending on this kind of information to make the call.
Yes, there is certainly, and that's the main problem. And I think we should not try to counter like direct threats in terms of disinformation. We have to go through the way of education, and it starts in school, like telling people how to read the news. My generation hasn't really been told that, like how to properly, like critically educate yourself and inform yourself. So it's very difficult for the authorities to actually really have a direct impact. I would say it's a long process.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Leonid, do you feel that what would you say would be Russia's agenda here in interfering, in meddling, in what kind of end goal is it looking for?
Well, I think the more trouble, the murkier the water, the easier it will be to fish in it. I think from Russia's perspective, any kind of destabilization or any kind of wedge which can be driven between the European Union and the United States and between the Western allies themselves is better because it would weaken the alliance. It would create the opportunity for Russia in terms of economic or export or influence and also some kind of attempt to control the situation and also make Russia look like an island of stability or the fantastic opportunity for Western investors to go and experiment with the opportunities which with the Eurasian customs union may provide, not only Russia but the Central Asian republics as well as Belarus, former Soviet republics. So I think that Russia is just acting normally. It's competition.
It's competition in the region, and it's important also. It's a huge election. It's an oldie country international parliamentarian in the region. And also, Professor Christian, there is a concern, of course, that there is a sudden agenda, as we just heard from Dr. Leonid, or what it could possibly be, but backing or having favorites of a certain kind of party. I mean, is it the far rights that they're looking to support? Or is it the far lefts or the centrists? What, in your opinion, is it that they are supporting here, the Russians?
Well, I mean, the Russians have clearly a network of parties that they have very, very close links with. On the whole, we can see a lot of far-right parties amongst them, whether that is the Austrian Freedom Party, Front National in France, whether that is Alternative für Deutschland, whether it's the Brexit Party in the UK. But at the same time, there's a number of far-left parties that are moderately linked to the Russians as well. And we can see some of those examples, former communist parties and so on, that are also pro-Russian. And even within the traditional parties, you will see elements where the Russians are also supporting individual politicians. I mean, it's very clear that also individual politicians within traditional parties are Russian cooperative partners. So we cannot say it is only the far right, but on the whole, the priority sits on the far right, with some exceptions.
Right. And Mr. Florian, there's also a concern that while EU struggles or is not being very effective in countering this disinformation, there's also the inherent sort of disenchantment of the voter, the loss of hope in the EU and its working and the disconnect it has. How does one counter that separately? Do you think that the smaller voter turnout of the years is because of that alone?
Well, I think many tried to tackle this issue at the moment. Like corporations, companies are now advertising they try to get people to vote. And I think the issue should be treated apart from Russian meddling, more about how do we educate people, inform people about what the European Union does, and that the European Union is also all of us together, and not just like it's often also portrayed in national media, that there is Brussels, an abstract Brussels, an EU bubble, which is detached and disconnected from the people. And I think it's just about right information and less about countering Russian interference.
All right. Thank you so much there, Mr. Florian, and also Dr. Leonid and Professor Christian for giving us your time and your input here. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for this segment. We're going to take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. We will be talking about Syria and what is happening in terms of the relationship between Turkey and Russia. Now, the fighting that took place last month in northwest Syria effectively shattered a truce that was agreed upon by Russia and Turkey last year, at the end of last year, in fact. Ankara was seen as not being able to keep its promises under the Sochi deal and has given Moscow, in a way, a reason, as Moscow says, to pursue a military solution in Idlib, where it earlier had agreed to a demilitarized zone. Also, Turkey is being seen to be struggling to maintain a delicate balance between its relations with respect to Syria, with the US and Russia. So we will be discussing today with our guests whether Russia and Turkey are making deals or parting ways in Syria. Let me introduce who we have with us. We have Mr. Alberto Rodriguez Garcia, a journalist whose focus is on MENA region, jihadism and criminal organizations. Also, we have with us Mr. Michael Arnold, the Deputy Researcher Editor of TRT World Research Center in Istanbul. Welcome to both of you to Newswire. We will be starting with you, Mr. Alberto. If you were to give your comments on whether you see Turkey and Russia evolving in their relationships with respect to Syria, or do you feel like it's slowly coming to a bit of a halt?
When we talk about the relationship between Russia and Turkey, we must understand the importance of the paper of Turkey in Idlib. In Idlib, the most important group is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is Al-Qaeda, but there is another group, which is the NFL, the National Liberation Front, which are Sunni mercenary and jihadist groups which are supported by Turkey. I mean, they have more presence in Aleppo, in Afrin, but they are in Idlib. So what it's trying to do, Russia, is to make them retreat to northern Syria in order to make the things easier for the Syrian Arab Army in this front line, which is one of the last rebel pockets in Syria, which is the problem that many rebel groups are having meetings with Golani, who is the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So I don't think that they will surrender easily. And for the moment, they are attacking with mortars civilian positions in government-held areas. So
Right.
for the moment, I don't think that Russia and Turkey are reaching very interesting or at least good agreements.
Right, because it was in a way Turkey's responsibility to sort of HTS there. Mr. Arnold, what is your take on this?
I think there's a number of issues at play, and it's probably a bit naive to actually boil it down merely to the continued presence of HTS. No doubt that remains an issue, but it's looking at how both the Turkish side and the Russian side have approached this, and at least their words in public, is very telling of where they stand on this. So to address the first point, nobody from the Russian side has come out to say that this is somehow some sort of final offensive to retake Idlib. If anything, they've indicated that there may be limited objectives that they may be willing to tolerate in this case. Mm-hmm. From the Turkish side, they've also been very clear to not lay any public blame on Russia for this. So all the criticism from the Turkish side has been directed towards the Syrian regime. When it comes to Russia, what they have called Russia for, whether coming from the Turkish defense minister or other officials, is to return to the Astana path. And so that becomes the basis of this Turkish-Russian relationship in Idlib in particular, in Syria in general, but Idlib in particular, is this Astana framework. And from the Turkish side, they are calling on the Russians to stick to that point. So I think there's a lot more factors at play here, as you yourself mentioned in the introduction. Turkey balancing between Russia and the United States and Syria. Right. So there's a lot of things at play here.
But do you feel, Mr. Arnold, do you feel that maybe there are finally cracks appear as a result of this? I mean, the escalation, the bombardment we have seen in northern Syria, there are up to, in different reports, 500 civilians who have been killed in these clashes.
Yeah, I would definitely say there's cracks, but there's been cracks from the very beginning. I mean, we can't. The Turkish-Russian relationship over Syria has never been one of exact concordance or exact agreement. You have to think they were backing from the beginning, even when they started to negotiate with each other and to figure out an agreement to end the war in Syria. They were still backing different sides. Russia is the primary backer of the regime, and Turkey is the primary backer of the armed opposition groups in the north. So there isn't 100% concordance on their relationship to begin with.
Right, but Mr. Alberto, they did have one common front, Russia and Turkey, and that was containing U.S. pressure in the region, in Syria, essentially. Do you feel like that maybe that is being lost in translation here? It is taking a backseat because there is a growing mistrust between the two?
These meetings that are being between Russia and Turkey, I think that they are trying to make things work or go on, but for the moment they aren't doing. What I want to say with this, for the moment when Syrian army attacked the northern Hama, Turkey retreat, they didn't put pressure against Syrian government or ask anything against Russia, but this isn't been useful because this isn't what Russia and Turkey agreed, what they reached. They said that there was going to be a de-escalation zone, that there was going to be a reconciliation between Russia and Turkey, and this is not happening. This never happened, and I think that it's not.
But Ankara being able to rein in HTS, how much of that do you think is contributing to this fission between these two?
I think that the most important thing is here that Hayat al-Sham and the regime aren't going to reach an agreement, never. Why? Because the Hayat al-Sham groups who are in Idlib are people who didn't want to reconcile with the regime in other parts of Syria, or it's the strongest, the hard group of Al-Qaeda. So they don't want to have any agreement. Golani told yesterday that anybody who surrender or wants reconciliation.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Rodriguez there. And we are now joined by Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi, Syrian Negotiations Commission's representative from Strasbourg. We're talking about whether there is a more apparent crack in the relationship between Russia and Turkey as the mistrust continues, the accusations against each other continue, with the growing escalation we see in northern Syria.
Well, we have first to understand certain facts about this northwestern region in Syria. It just encompasses around 4 governorates, and it's close to Turkey. And the security issue for Turkey is an important one. Mm-hmm. Another fact is that it has over 3.5 million civilians. Mm-hmm. The pretext being used by Russia and by the regime, the Assad regime, being protected by Russia and Iran, is that there are terrorists there. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, they haven't yet, during the last 3 weeks of bombardment, targeted any terrorist area or group. Mm-hmm. We didn't see any victim. We saw civilian victims. Mm-hmm. We saw hospitals being destroyed. Mm-hmm. The number is 13. And the number of schools being targeted, 16, and markets. We have a regime that doesn't want to go into the political process, and it's being supported in this idea by Russia. They wanted to design a certain solution that fits the size of the regime, that fits the interests of Russia, mm-hmm. and at the same time fits the Iranian interests. As such, they found the world against this move, mm-hmm. because this bombardment is causing the displacement of over 350,000 people close to the borders of Turkey now. Right. Now, they are violating by this an agreement struck in Sochi between Turkey and Russia, right. and which was considered to be a de-escalation area, mm-hmm. Irrespective of whatever agreement there is, they are continuing their attack.
Right, but okay, so let me come to you here, Mr. Michael. You've Dr. Yahya's take on this. This is something that was understood. Russia wanted a military solution, and Turkey wanted to negotiate. And so they came up with an agreement where they were ready to compromise. But something triggered a escalation again. They ran out of patience. What do you think was the main reason that started this once all over again?
Well, I think there's a lot of speculation there, but there's any number of factors. So, of course, there's the pretext of HTS, which remains an issue. Of course, it remains an issue for Turkey as well. Let's not forget that Turkey also considers this group to be a terrorist organization. So there is some mutual agreement there. But there's a number of factors at play here as well. There's the possibility. Again, it's speculation. There's the possibility that this could be Russia allowing the regime to move forward to pressure Turkey a little bit in terms of trying to ensure that maybe they're coming back to their side more in their negotiations with the Americans, right? So there's been progress with negotiations with the Americans on northeastern Syria with Turkey's behalf. That may not be something that the Russians are fully pleased with as well. So this could be a means as well of pressuring Turkey. And hence why I was saying earlier why from the Russian angle at least, mm-hmm. Possibly not from the regime, but ultimately the regime cannot operate really without Russia's green light, of limited objectives here, of pressuring Turkey and its allies in the region to maybe come back to the negotiating table, to accept less than that was already on the table.
Right, and that's a good point there. You read how May 2nd, I believe, there were these talks between Turkey and the US, where the foreign minister of Turkey sat down, and they agreed to establishing a security zone. And that was, Dr. Yahya, you feel like that maybe would be something that would have upset Moscow a lot?
In Astana, there was talk about de-escalation areas. They said about Idlib, about this region, that there wouldn't be an agreement. I don't know. They have their reasons for such a thing. However, with the pressure being exercised on Iran, being strangulated by the United States, in the last attack, they didn't appear. They were not their full gear. That's one. Another thing that the Russians all along wanted, as I said, a solution according to military diktats. A political one by military means, which doesn't work as far as Syrians are concerned. And again, as I said, they wanted the regime to have control over all the geography in Syria, thinking that the geography is land, it is buildings, it is something materialistic. It is the souls of the people who reject such a regime. For the past 8 years, as your guest has just said, that there is a conflict between people and a dictatorship, a regime that is used all brutal means in order to remain in power.
Right. But the conflict is getting worse. The escalation, the death toll is on the rise. 150,000 people in Idlib are displaced. And now we are seeing fractures between Russia and Turkey. What, in your opinion, is the way forward here? How does one go about in resolving, in de-escalating the conflict?
Now, well, as you know, that Russia has, before it got into Syria, it has files, it has conflicts with the West regarding Crimea, regarding the rockets issue, regarding Georgia, and other sorts of conflicts. And it wanted, in one way or another, to have some sort of soft relations with the West, Europe, and the United States. And it has used Syria as a strategic area close to Israel, which is of interest to the United States. The United States cares a lot about Israel and its interests. And as such, they wanted to use Syria as a springboard in order to settle all those complicated files that it carries on its back.
Okay.
Now, there are talks between Turkey and the United States, talks between Turkey and Russia. And at the same time, we know that the two powers, the United States and Russia, when they come to an agreement, a conflict, whatever horrible its nature is, would come to some sort of solution. Now, as such, we haven't seen this thing happening yet, because.
Right. But there's a risk of this situation getting even more complicated. Michael, we have seen U.S. and Russia sort of indirectly butt heads over the purchase of the S-400s that Turkey wants from Russia and is going ahead with. Now, obviously, this does some way affect how they negotiate a situation in Syria. How do you see them moving forward from here?
Well, I think what you'll see from the Turkish side, I mean, you're right to point out there's a number of complicated issues here, including the S-400. But I think what we've seen and what you'll continue to see from Turkish officials, at least from the Turkish side, is a reiteration for Astana to be respected. That is the framework within which they have been approaching Syria for the last while. And I think that's the framework that they will continue to try to approach with. Even with this latest escalation in Idlib, the call is for Astana to be respected and the terms of the Astana agreement to be implemented, which includes, of course, the de-escalation zone, which includes, of course, being able to remove HTS. So that's all part of the deal. And Turkey, I think, will continue to call for that deal to be implemented from their side, as well as from the Russians and the Iranians as well.
Absolutely. Now, Astana, of course, is a very important Astana talks in respecting what was what was decided in them is a big part of it, even though no breakthrough was made back when they were discussing this back in April. But Dr. Yahya, the Turkish force is also facing a possible isolation from the Syrian opposition that it's had support from, especially when they see they don't see Turkey really raising a voice on how Russia is operating now in northern Syria.
Well, on the contrary, coordination between opposition and Turkey is at its best, I believe. Mm-hmm. We understand that the Turks have security concerns, and we care about that as much as Russia, as much as Turkey cares about hosting over 3 million Syrian civilians who were displaced from Syria. We understand that Turkey is not in a very healthy situation due to the conflict between the United States and Russia. Turkey tries to coordinate with the United States on certain issues regarding the F-35 jets deal, and at the same time the S-400 deal with Russia. Now, to what extent they succeed in making this balance between the East and the West, if we can say so, we're not quite sure. But however, we understand they have a constant fixed position towards not letting the Russians, the regime, the Iranians mess up this area, which is of concern to its security. And another thing about this matter is the presence of over 3.5 million civilians who would flee into the Turkish border, and after that they could just flood the European countries if this continues. That's another concern, another problem for them.
Right. So it essentially comes down to how Russia and Turkey will come to an agreement on the situation in Syria. Thank you so much, Dr. Yahya and Mr. Michael. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have. We will see you tomorrow. Till then, goodbye.